Hey guys, tonight we slip past carved wooden doors and moonlit rice paper walls to explore something as delicate as silk but sharp enough to cut through centuries' female virginity in ancient China. You tiptoe across creaky floorboards of time, right into the hushed inner quarters of a family compound where girls are hidden like porcelain heirlooms. Their footsteps must be quiet, their glances downward, and their secrets sealed tighter than a dragon's treasure chest. You're in the boudoir of a teenage bride-to-be, and everything around you feels both magical and maddening. Hair combs carved from jade, embroidered red bedding, a sense that everyone, yes, even that nosy aunt 3 doors down cares deeply about what may or may not be happening between your legs. Welcome to a world where virtue is a social currency and virginity. It's the gold standard. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see who's staying up with us tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story starts behind closed doors. You're not even allowed to speak much here, let alone laugh out loud or ask too many questions. If you're a girl, your life is divided into 3 silent acts: maiden wife, and if you're lucky, widow, and your worth. Often measured by whether you made it to the 2nd act without ever being alone with a boy. In ancient Chinese society, particularly during dynasties like the Han and Tang, a woman's body was treated like family property, curated, and guarded with the intensity of a national artifact. Her virginity, a symbol of the household's honor, a banner flapping in the wind of social judgment. The family compound wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. Think fewer cuddly relatives and more hovering sentinels of morality. Now, picture this. You're 13, maybe 14. Your feet are bound another charming tradition, and you're being taught embroidery tea pouring and the fine art of smiling without showing teeth. Every stitch, every gesture is about control. About becoming desirable but untouched. It's like being a beautifully gift-wrapped box no one is allowed to peek inside until a wedding night, where suddenly everyone wants to see the contents. But why all the fuss? The Confucian ideal of nude or female virtue wasn't just a vague guideline, it was a code of conduct etched into the bones of society. Virginity was considered the first and often most critical proof of that virtue. A girl who maintained hers was praised as a filial daughter, a pious soul, and a righteous wife-to-be. A girl who didn't, she was whispered about, avoided, sometimes even disowned. The weird part. You didn't have to do anything for this prize, just not do. A lifetime award for inaction. That's like giving someone a trophy for never eating cake. And yes, some of these girls didn't even know what cake was. Your body became a canvas for your family's reputation. To keep it pure, your movements were monitored, your clothing modest, and your social interactions so limited you could probably count your conversations with boys on one hand and still have fingers left over. But let's not sugarcoat it. The intensity was brutal. In aristocratic households, girls were sometimes locked indoors for months before marriage to preserve their bloom, as the poets would say. Even the servants were instructed to keep a watchful eye because God forbid a maiden have an opinion, or worse, a crush. Historians still argue whether this extreme cloistering was more about protection or paranoia. Was it really about keeping girls safe? Or was it a way to ensure men could exchange wives like unblemished scrolls of silk, confident no one else had touched the parchment? Meanwhile, folklore didn't help either. Take the lantern tale whispered among grandmothers and gossips. A girl whose virginity was in question might be asked to light a paper lantern and carry it through a courtyard. If the flame flickered or died, she was unclean. Magical thinking, absolutely. But imagine being 16 and trying to walk straight while a crowd watches you with hawk eyes and burning curiosity. Still, not everything was deadly serious. Some families would throw elaborate rituals for a daughter's blooming complete with red ribbons, sticky rice cakes, and the subtle implication look, she's fresh. Eligible, untouched one scholar even joked that a girl's chastity was marketed with the same enthusiasm as a new breed of rice. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just about you. Your virginity was a family business venture. Marrying you off as a virgin meant a higher bride price. That's more grain, more land, better political alliances. If you messed that up, you didn't just break hearts, you broke contracts. But not everyone played by the rules. There were whispers of girls who fell in love, ran away. Or, scandal of scandals, refused to marry at all. Some were caught, some were in. One fringe tale tells of a merchant's daughter who pretended to be a boy for years just to escape the suffocating purity game. She ended up becoming a poet, maybe even a spy. Historians debate whether she ever existed, but the legend itself says a lot. And yet, even amid the restrictions, there was poetry, lyrical longing, secret letters folded like origami hearts. Love didn't die in this world, it just had to wear a veil and speak in riddles. So, you see, female virginity in ancient China wasn't just a medical status or a moral checkbox. It was the opening move in a lifelong performance where the curtain rose before you ever spoke a line. And tonight, you're backstage peeking through the silk folds. You're hovering now over a crimson marriage bed, embroidered with double happiness symbols, the scent of sandalwood curling in the air like a spell. The bride is trembling, not from cold or excitement, but from the weight of eyes, even the ones not physically in the room. You feel it right, that ghostly pressure pressing down on your shoulders. It's wedding night in ancient China, and you're not alone even when the door finally closes. See, tonight's not just about you and your new husband fumbling through marital rituals. It's about proof. Tangible, undeniable proof that you were in fact a virgin. That your family's honor is intact, and your body, like a sealed scroll, has been opened only now and only properly. It all comes down to one deeply problematic piece of evidence, the bloody sheet. This is where the blood on the bed ritual takes center stage. You, the bride, are expected to bleed during your first sexual experience. That stain, not symbolic, literal. Mothers-in-law wait outside with eagle ears and even sharper expectations. Servants may be posted nearby ready to inspect linens like forensic detectives. And if the sheet remains clean, oof, let's just say no one's clapping. Historians still argue whether this ritual was common across all regions or just in the upper classes. But there's no doubt that in many households, this single night decided whether you'd be welcomed or whispered about for the rest of your life. Now imagine the pressure. The man, often older and just as anxious, is coached by his own family to make sure she bleeds. The girl. She may have no clue what's about to happen. Some don't even know how babies are made, let alone what pain to expect. In extreme cases, an older woman would offer advice before the wedding, usually more terrifying than helpful. One such tip, recorded in Qing Dynasty diaries, bite a silk ribbon if you must scream. And what if there isn't blood? Well, that's when the rumors begin. The mother-in-law may accuse the bride of premarital impropriety. Some families demand a return of the bride price, claiming they were deceived. In more severe cases, the bride could be sent back to her parents in disgrace. And yes, there were incidents of suicide following such humiliations. Not from guilt, but from the impossible suffocating shame. Funny thing is, not haha funny, but absurd funny. Not all women bleed their first time. You probably knew that. Ancient Chinese medical texts. Not so much. The popular belief was that a virgin's body contained a sealed chamber, a so-called jade gate, which would be broken by intercourse releasing a sacred red fluid. If it didn't appear, accusations flew like arrows. Now, here's the quirky fringe tidbit. In some regions, there were women who specialized in fabricating wedding night blood. A little crushed beetroot, a little duck's blood, voila. Crisis averted. It wasn't exactly legal, but you tried telling a terrified 16-year-old bride to take the honest route when her entire reputation is on the line. Some even went full stagecraft, smearing the linens ahead of time, hiding the evidence, then dramatically revealing the sheet like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. Ta-da, purity confirmed. Meanwhile, her new husband is usually clueless or just relieved to have passed the unspoken test. What's even more twisted? This performance wasn't just for the couple, it was for both families. Marriages were alliances, business deals with flowers and firecrackers. If the bride turned out impure, it wasn't just a scandal. It was a breach of contract. Families could break ties. Legal disputes might follow. Think less romantic comedy, more courtroom drama with drums and ancestral curses. But here's where things get a little messier and more human. In some households, there were gentler versions of the tradition. If the bride didn't bleed but was otherwise well-mannered, families might turn a blind eye. Maybe she's just athletic, one old lady might mutter. Or she fell from a tree as a child. These weren't scientific explanations, but convenient myths to save face. Because sometimes even strict systems bend when people are tired of drama. Still, most brides weren't so lucky. The fear of being labeled damaged goods led many to stay silent about childhood assaults, teenage experiments, or even medical conditions. It wasn't about truth, it was about optics. You had to look pure, seem pure, bleed pure. And the aftermath, it didn't end with a stained bedsheet. If the bride passed, she earned praise gifts and a slightly more breathable position in the household. The mother-in-law might smile. The servants might gossip, but kindly this time. If she failed, she was shunned. Even if the husband liked her. Even if she was kind, intelligent, and loyal. Virginity had already stacked the deck before she'd even drawn her first card. One late Ming-era joke puts it like this: a woman's purity is proven with pain and laundry. Dark humor, yes, but not wrong. You might wonder, was there any empathy? Any rebellion? Tiny, flickering sparks? Some philosophers questioned the obsession. A few Buddhist monks argued that inner virtue mattered more than hymnal status. Taoist texts mused on energy flows, sometimes ignoring virginity altogether, in favor of balance and harmony. But these were whispers in a roaring hall. The societal machinery pressed on iron-willed and unblinking. And guess what? The practice of inspecting wedding sheets didn't completely vanish. It echoed faintly into later dynasties, into rural towns, even into 20th century customs in some areas. The red sheet became folklore, a symbol, a curse, a reminder of how womanhood was wrapped, judged, and unwrapped again, all under the gaze of someone else. So here you are standing beside that marital bed. The ceremony's over. The door clicks shut. The candles flicker. And outside, a household waits. For what exactly? For a piece of cloth. For a smear of red. For proof that you were what they wanted. You wake up the next morning, if you manage to sleep at all, and it's not just the ache in your body or the vague nausea from too much rice wine that greets you. It's the sound of feet outside your chamber, whispers snaking through the halls like incense smoke. People want to know. Did you pass the test? Was there blood? Did honor survive the night? But see, this moment isn't just about your marriage. It's about your ancestors. Yeah, you heard right. Ghosts are watching. Not the creepy movie kind with flickering candles and jump scares, but the ancient spirits of your bloodline. And they're invested. In Confucianism-rooted tradition, especially throughout dynasties like the Han and Song, everything revolves around filial piety and ancestral reverence. You're not just marrying into a family. You're becoming a vessel for its future. So you shuffle into a world where your womb is now a sacred site. Your body isn't merely your own. It's a bridge, a promise, a contract with generations past and yet to come. Virginity, in this context, is less about sex and more about cosmological integrity. I know it sounds like something out of a spiritual user manual, but for ancient Chinese families, purity kept the ancestral line untainted. Like passing along a holy torch that must never flicker. You bow before the household shrine, burn paper offerings, and place food on the altar gifts for relatives long dead but still very opinionated. And you feel the weight of their presence. It's not paranoia, it's protocol. If a bride is not chaste, it's believed the spirits could grow angry. Crops might fail. Misfortune could befall the home. Even a poorly timed sneeze might be blamed on dishonorable union. Historians still argue whether these ancestral punishments were metaphorical or actually feared in day-to-day life. But records from family archives show that maintaining lineage purity was taken seriously. This wasn't superstition for fun, it was existential risk management. And what's at the center of all that risk you? Your virginity is tied to lineage legitimacy. Because if a woman is pregnant before marriage or is suspected of previous intimacy, how can the family be sure the child she bears belongs to their bloodline? It's not just a personal issue, it's genealogical security. Like the world's most invasive paternity insurance policy, you now exist as part wife, part broodmare, part spiritual insurance plan. The stakes, eternal harmony, or generational dishonor. No pressure. Let's take it a step further. In this universe, your reproductive potential doesn't just belong to your husband, it belongs to the clan. Your child will be a link in a sacred chain, a future caretaker of ancestral tablets and burial grounds. If you're not a virgin at marriage, you're seen as risking contamination. And contamination in ancient Chinese cosmology could poison the whole tree. And the clan system. Oh, it's no small thing. Families didn't live in cozy nuclear units. They were part of large, tightly governed kinship groups that tracked births, marriages, and deaths like obsessive historians. These records, Jiapu, had real power. If your name didn't make the cut, you might as well not have existed. But let's get real. People aren't spreadsheets, and desire doesn't read rule books. Not every bride fit the mold. There were stories scandalous whispered at mealtime of women who gave birth to sons before marriage. and if those sons were strong, smart, or successful. Sometimes the past got rewritten. She was a virgin, of course, they'd say. She just bled invisibly. A convenient myth. Virginity became elastic, its proof retrofitted to match outcomes. One fascinating fringe tale from the Ming period involves a noblewoman who was widowed at 17 before the marriage was consummated. Rather than remarry, she claimed to remain a virgin widow for the rest of her life. She was praised as a paragon of loyalty, even venerated. Scholars later speculated she may have had a secret lover or two, but no one cared because she had checked the right symbolic boxes. In other words, perception beat truth, and this wasn't rare. Virginity in ancient China wasn't always a literal anatomical fact. It was a narrative. If people believed you were chaste if you performed it well enough, your legacy was safe. And if they didn't, even the most innocent girl could be erased from the family line like a bad debt. Let's pivot to a more philosophical take. Confucianism didn't invent the obsession with purity, but it turbocharged it. Its emphasis on hierarchy control and filial order meant that everybody had to play their part perfectly. For women, that meant being obedient daughters, loyal wives, and silent wombs. Virginity wasn't just your job. It was your audition. You failed. You didn't even get to read for the role. Taoism, on the other hand, offered a different view sometimes. While Confucian ethics were laser-focused on external virtue, Taoist texts occasionally praised inner harmony over rigid morality. Some Taoist priestesses were even allowed gasp to live independently, choose their own paths, and occasionally ignore virginity entirely. But those women were the exception, and the Confucianists made sure everyone remembered it. Still, the idea that virginity kept the spirits calm and the ancestors smiling stuck like lacquer. Even today, some rural rituals quietly nod to it. A red cloth under the bridal bed. A midnight incense offering. A whispered hope that the line continues unbroken. Of course, the system wasn't perfect, and people being people workarounds abounded. A desperate family might fabricate a daughter's purity. A clever girl might fake modesty with Oscar-worthy talent. And occasionally, love snuck in through the back door, awkward, risky, real. Because beneath all this ritual and fear, you're still human. You still dream, still ache, still imagine what it would be like to be loved not for your purity, but for your laughter, your wit, your mind. But that's not what anyone's asking. They want blood, babies, balance, and maybe, just maybe, a little peace from the ghosts. You're sitting now in the courtyard sipping something bitter from a porcelain cup, your gaze skimming the sky for answers that never come. Someone's sweeping in the corner. A rooster crows. The air smells like damp earth and steamed buns. But inside, you're not calm. You're calculating. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you at the wedding feast once you're married, virginity doesn't disappear, it just changes costume. It becomes chastity. And now that you're a wife, you're expected to wear that virtue like a second skin, tight and unbreathable. Your virginity might have been the ticket into the marriage, but chastity. That's the price of staying in it honorably or of surviving widowhood with dignity. See, in ancient China, being a faithful wife meant more than keeping your vows. It meant living in a state of controlled, spotless behavior. Your body might no longer be sealed, but your loyalty that better be impenetrable. And just in case you were tempted to think, well, at least I got the hard part over with welcome to the world of chaste widowhood, here's the brutal reality. If your husband dies, the world expects you to press pause on your life. Indefinitely. You're supposed to wrap yourself in grief like a permanent winter coat, and never ever consider remarrying. Because to do so would be to pollute your virtue, break your bond with his ancestors, and, let's face it, offend the whole village. Historians still argue whether this ideal was equally enforced across social classes, but for elite women especially, the pressure was immense. The imperial government even handed out special plaques, archways of chastity to widows who never remarried. Think of it like a lifetime achievement award for loneliness. These weren't just private tributes. We're talking full-on architectural monuments carved with the widow's name praising her purity and devotion. Neighbors would pass them on the way to the market. Children would point at them during walks. Look, Ma. That's where Lady Liu stayed faithful for 40 years until she died with her hair unpinned and her soul intact. But let's rewind a bit. What if you're still happily married, dutifully boiling herbs and managing the household ledgers? Your virtue isn't on autopilot. One wrong move, too much laughter with a male servant, a trip to the well unchaperoned, and the rumor mill creaks to life. Chastity, unlike virginity, doesn't require anatomical proof, just suspicion, and that makes it scarier. If virginity was about a body, chastity was about narrative control. You had to tell a perfect story every single day. Demure glances, silent deference, long sleeves. A flawless wife. And even if you were flawless, you weren't safe. All it took was a jealous aunt, a bitter sister-in-law, or a gossipy neighbor with a sharp tongue to poison your image. There's a grim little tale from the Song dynasty about a woman accused of infidelity just because she wrote poetry in secret. Her husband's family found her verses misunderstood a metaphor about longing, and boom, she was cast out. She hadn't touched another man. She just thought too passionately. Oops, that's the thing. In a culture built on control, female emotion itself became suspicious. Now, here's a quirky twist. During the Ming era, one court official was so obsessed with ensuring his wife's fidelity that he built a tower with no exits and kept her inside whenever he traveled. He even left food and scrolls for entertainment. Romantic, right? Historians still debate whether he was deeply insecure or just theatrically paranoid, but either way, she became known locally as the Pagoda Bride. Meanwhile, in rural communities, chaste behavior was enforced with folk rituals and community watchfulness. Some towns had a widow's patrol, not an official group, but older women who made it their business to monitor younger widows for any signs of romantic interest. You smile at someone, twice scandal. You wear red, outrage. You laugh at a joke in the rice fields, you're practically a harlot. But let's not forget the wild card, Confucian guilt. It wasn't always about external pressure. You'd internalize it like the smoky flavor of tea leaves steeped too long. Girls were taught from childhood that female virtue was their life's essence. You'd memorize lines like a woman's honor is lighter than dust, but once stained it cannot be cleansed. Catchy, miserable, effective. You didn't need guards at your door. Your conscience would do the job just fine. Still, some women pushed back quietly, subtly, with the grace of ink slipping through parchment. They became literati-penned satirical plays or communicated with sympathetic sisters-in-law through carefully worded embroidery. Yes, embroidered poetry was a thing. Cross-stitches with double meanings. The original subtweet. And yet, for every small rebellion, the weight of social norms pressed harder. Because chastity wasn't just about the woman. It was about the family's reputation. A chaste wife elevated her husband's status. A chaste widow brought eternal pride to her in-laws. And should a woman falter even posthumously, her children could suffer. Examinations might be denied. Marriage prospects could vanish. Entire bloodlines could dim. So you learn to act with restraint, to silence yourself before speaking, to smile without meaning. You perfect the art of invisibility except when it's time to perform your virtue. Then, ironically, you're expected to shine. You're a ghost and a beacon, a memory in motion. And all the while you wonder, did anyone ask if he was faithful? Spoiler alert, they didn't. Men weren't held to the same standards. Not even close. They could remarry, visit courtesans, even maintain concubines without moral backlash. Chastity in this universe was a gendered currency valuable only when stored in a woman's body. But there were outliers. Occasionally, a husband might remain celibate after his wife's death, claiming he would never find her equal. People would applaud, maybe even tear up. But no one expected it. It was virtue by bonus points, not obligation. Meanwhile, your chastity is non-negotiable, eternal, exhausting. So you sit in the courtyard, eyes half-lidded, listening to the soft clink of porcelain and the mutter of the wind. You sip your bitter tea. And you smile the way you've practiced, knowing that every twitch of your mouth is a line in your story. A story that must never go off script, not if you want to stay sacred. You step carefully along the stone path, each footfall measured like a verse in an ancient poem, because everything you do is being watched by the living, the dead. And sometimes it feels the sky itself. But here's the twist. No one warns you about your virtue isn't just your own. It's the currency your family trades with. Your body is a social investment and virginity. That's your opening balance. In ancient China, a daughter wasn't just a daughter. She was a marriage asset. Families, especially among the gentry and merchant classes, treated her as part of a long game of alliances, legacy, and status. Your chastity. That's what kept the stock high. See, marriages were more than love stories. They were strategic pacts sealed between households. And virginity wasn't just a virtue. It was a guarantee of quality. A symbolic seal that your family upheld Confucian values, produced proper women, and could be trusted to merge honorably with another lineage. Historians still argue whether this system truly reflected affectionless alliances, or if love occasionally bloomed beneath the paperwork. But the mechanics were clear. Your purity was part of your family's resume. If you were found to be impure, your family's entire reputation could tarnish like silver left out in the rain. In some regions, dowries would be returned or halved. Matchmakers might blacklist your siblings, and in extreme cases, a family might stage a fake illness, send you to a convent, or remarry you far away where no one knew your name. It's not just about shame. It's about social logistics. Let's pause for a quirky tidbit. Ever hear of virginity testers? Yup, some wealthier families in later dynasties reportedly employed older women to evaluate the bride before the wedding night. A combination of medical myth, superstition, and total invasion of privacy. These women weren't doctors. They were like the bouncers of bodily honor, and their track record dubious at best. Meanwhile, matchmakers operated like high-stakes brokers with a mental spreadsheet of who was still untouched, who had a mysterious incident at age 15, and whose family might quietly pay more to hush it all up. Entire marriages pivoted on a single rumor. You remember that one cousin who tripped on the stairs and got a bruise on her hip. She didn't leave her house for weeks. Not because she was hurt, because someone might misinterpret the injury. A chaste girl wasn't even allowed to look handled. That's how precarious your virtue is. And here's another layer. The word used for virginity in many classical texts, gen, also translates as steadfast, loyal, or even unyielding. So your body was expected to do more than resist touch. It was supposed to resist temptation, rumor, even grief. You had to be emotionally unshakable, like a jade statue, beautiful, hard, and silent. Even the way you walked mattered. A modest gait, eyes lowered, hands tucked inside sleeves. A girl who swayed too much, possibly corrupt. A girl who sang while cooking. Watch her. Someone has probably already started etching her name into the bad wife registry. Not a real book, but might as well be. Yet, despite this pressure, some families maneuvered the system with creativity. Say you weren't a virgin, but the family needed the match. A sudden, heartfelt vow of chastity. A hidden herbal concoction to cause bleeding on the wedding night. A deeply loyal wet nurse who remembered wrongly about that mysterious fever 2 winters ago. Virginity wasn't just physical, it was narratively flexible if the stakes were high enough. Still, for many, it wasn't a game. It was survival. Take a family in a small town with just one daughter. She's been groomed since infancy to marry into a slightly wealthier merchant household. If she loses her virginity voluntarily or not, the deal could fall apart. Her brothers might lose their apprenticeships. Her parents, their standing in the ancestral temple. Her uncle might even blame the family curse and stop speaking to them. All that weight lands squarely on one teenage girl's shoulders. And we haven't even gotten to concubines yet. If you're from a lower-ranking family, or if your background is murky but your face is bright enough, you might be taken in not as a wife, but as a secondary woman. A concubine. Your virginity still matters. It's part of the allure, but it's no longer about honor. It's about value. The first wife might resent you and you'll live in her shadow, but your unbroken status gives you leverage. Maybe even a chance at your child being recognized as legitimate. In some twisted way, virginity became a social ladder. If you had it, you might climb. If you lost it, you might plummet. No wonder so many girls clutched their silence like a pearl shiny hard and impossible to open without shattering it. Let's not forget the imperial court where things got next level. Imperial concubines underwent strict selection processes, health checks, lineage reviews, and, yes, virginity confirmation. These weren't just mistresses. They were political pawns, potential bearers of future emperors. Your body wasn't just yours. It was now imperial property. Congratulations. There's a famous tale of a girl who faked virginity, with an old healer's trick swallow a concoction of alum and rice water to tighten the body, then bite your lip until it bled during consummation. Not exactly FDA approved, but apparently convincing enough for the emperor. And still, the myth held power. But beneath the ceremony and scheming what's wild is how few people stopped to question why virginity mattered this much. It wasn't really about virtue. It was about proof. Proof of control, lineage obedience. Proof that your family had done their job raising you. Proof that your new family could trust you not to mix the bloodline. Historians still debate whether these rituals came from real anxieties or elite male fantasy. Was it paranoia, patriarchy, a purity cult, disguised as Confucian ethics? Maybe all three. So you adjust your hairpin, smooth your sleeve, and stand like jade. Not because you believe in all of this, But because in your world belief is optional, compliance is not, and your family's name. It's resting gently on the curve of your back. The wind stirs the courtyard again as you move inside, careful not to let your sleeves brush against the family altar. The ancestors are watching always. Watching, but tonight their silent gazes feel heavier than usual. That's because you're not just a daughter or a wife anymore. You're a vessel of lineage. And in ancient China, that means your womb is practically sacred real estate. Let's get right to it. Virginity wasn't only about purity or obedience. It was also about paternity certainty. When your husband's family took you in, they weren't just gaining a new member, they were securing an unbroken bloodline. And to do that, they needed to be 100% sure that the children you bore were theirs. So yes, your body became an extension of the family tree. Think of it as a precious orchard, carefully fenced, heavily guarded. Any whisper of prior use, that orchard's value plummets. And this isn't just poetic metaphor, it's legal too. Ancient Chinese inheritance laws were patrilineal property passed from father to son. Daughters were often excluded, and mothers only relevant if their sons were legitimate. So, if your virginity was in doubt, your children's legitimacy could be too. And that meant land, wealth, ancestral rights, all of it could be disputed. Historians still argue whether these laws were strictly enforced in all regions. But one thing's clear in upper-class families, especially among the gentry and literati, preserving the clarity of bloodlines was a full-time obsession. Here's a fringe tidbit that's oddly telling. Some old family contracts included clauses stating that if a bride was found not to be a virgin, any offspring would be disinherited. Imagine living under a clause that treats your baby as a returnable item. Rough. And just so we're clear, the burden of proof wasn't on your husband to show fidelity. It was on you to prove undisturbed origin. The family needed to be certain your child carried untainted blood. Virginity became their seal of genetic authenticity, like a wax stamp. Except you don't get to melt it. This obsession had spiritual roots, too. Ancestral worship, the beating heart of Confucian family life, required clarity. When your husband dies, it's your job to ensure his spirit is honored properly through offerings, prayers, and lineage continuation. But if your children aren't truly his, that spiritual thread gets knotted. Ancestral spirits get confused or worse, insulted. You can almost hear one ghost muttering from the incense smoke. Who's this kid? I didn't authorize this. So yes, it's heavy. And let's not forget women who couldn't bear sons were often sidelined, divorced, or demoted in the household hierarchy. But women who bore sons under a cloud of impurity, even worse. You could be erased entirely. Your name scratched off the family genealogy book like it was never written in the first place. It's why, when your wedding night comes, the sheets aren't just sheets. They're evidence. You remember this from your cousin's ceremony, the older women in the house quietly checking for red stains the next morning. If they found them, they sighed with relief. If they didn't, well, there were whispers for weeks. You ever try sleeping when your dignity's under forensic review? It's not great. Now, here's where it gets particularly intense. Some families built ancestral temples with strict rules. Only pure blood descendants could be worshipped inside. That means if your legitimacy was ever questioned even centuries later, you and your children might be excluded from ancestral rites. Imagine being kicked out of a spiritual family reunion by a ghost. Some of this anxiety was passed down through documents. Lineage records were obsessively updated, detailing births, marriages, and deaths, often with little annotations like first wife, son of concubine, or even more damning, born before marriage. That last one was a polite code for we're not really sure, but sometimes the stress around all this produced real emotional havoc. One young bride from the Qing dynasty, recorded in a family archive, was said to have burned herself before her wedding night out, of fear she wouldn't bleed and would bring shame to her family. She left a note insisting on her purity. Imagine that a girl so afraid of being disbelieved that she'd rather die than be questioned. You sit with that for a moment. The stillness, the grief in it. Yet it wasn't all tragedy. There were women who found subtle ways to reclaim control. Some deliberately delayed their wedding nights, citing menstrual taboos or dreams from ancestors that required spiritual cleansing first. This bought them time. Time to prepare. Time to ensure everything looked right. Virginity as theater. And they played the part with quiet brilliance. Meanwhile, men. They had no such script. Their fidelity was rarely policed, their children rarely questioned. A man could bring a concubine's son into the family line without scandal. But a woman. Even a murmur of impurity turned her entire womb into a courtroom. And of course, the double standard had consequences. In rare cases, a husband would die before his wife conceived. The family, desperate for an heir, might stage a ghost marriage pairing her spirit with his in the afterlife, or even spiritually adopting a child from another branch of the family tree to serve as the heir. All to maintain the illusion of unbroken blood. Sometimes widows were even pressured to raise another woman's child as their own, as long as the line of descent stayed neat on paper. Real biology. Less important than perceived purity. And yes, this is the part where your head starts to spin, because virginity wasn't just about you. It was about the family's future, the ancestors' peace, and the child's inheritance rights. All of it neatly folded into the fragile concept of unbroken lineage. And the terrifying part, one unproven suspicion, could unravel all of it. So you sip your tea a little slower. Watch the steam curl like incense. And wonder if your children someday maybe will carry your name proudly, or if they'll spend their lives chasing the shadow of an accusation you never got to answer. In ancient China, lineage was forever, but a woman's place in it conditional. You sit perfectly still as the afternoon bell tolls from the nearby temple, its echo bouncing lazily off the rooftops like a reminder that time in this world is measured by obedience. And nothing says obedient in ancient China quite like your mother's voice whispering, "A good woman brings no shame to her ancestors." That shame. It's almost always tied to sex, or rather the strict avoidance of it. Virginity was seen not just as your responsibility, but your core identity, a moral status engraved into your soul. Lose it, and not through marriage, and you didn't just fall in social rank. You were devalued as a human being. People didn't say you had made a mistake. They said you were ruined. Ruined girls, spoiled girls, dishonored girls. There was a whole thesaurus of sadness waiting to land on your head. Even the language around this is brutal. A girl who remained chaste was called Jeanne Nu, a virtuous woman. But a girl suspected of impurity. You got words like yin, fu, lewd woman, or worse, bu chun, impure. These weren't just insults. These were social death sentences. And the scariest part, you could get labeled impure without doing a thing. Maybe a boy looked at you too long. Maybe someone saw you outside during dusk hours. Maybe a neighbor was just feeling petty. One whispered story could undo your whole future, and poof. There goes your marriage prospects, your dowry negotiation, your family's pride. Historians still debate whether rural communities enforced these labels more harshly than urban ones, but it's widely accepted that reputation management was a full-time job for young women and their families. Let's detour for a quirky example in one village custom. During the Ming Dynasty, families would sew small mirrors into a girl's wedding robe. Why? Because mirrors reflect the truth, and supposedly if a girl had lied about her virginity, the mirror would crack during the ceremony. Real science. Not at all. Real fear. Absolutely. What's worse is how easily this ruin label could stick. There wasn't much of a redemption arc. Confucian teachings offered no born-again virgin clause. Unlike in some cultures where repentance could restore moral standing here, the stain was permanent ink. It didn't matter if you were forced tricked or just young and curious. A fallen woman was simply fallen, and once you were ruined, you entered a whole different social category, often living in silence under house arrest or sent off to distant relatives. In wealthier households, you might be sent to a Buddhist nunnery to repent. But let's not romanticize that it wasn't about spiritual growth. It was about exile in silk robes. Yet, here's where it gets truly absurd. Even when a woman did remain chaste, say she never married, never looked sideways at a man, and kept her honor locked tighter than the emperor's vault, people still whispered, "Oh, why is she unmarried? Does she think she's better than everyone?" Too much virtue is suspicious, too. Can't win, right? This social paranoia reached its peak with the rise of the chaste widow ideal. Picture this: your husband dies young. You're 20, no children yet, and your in-laws expect you to spend the rest of your life in mourning clothes, guarding your virginity like a museum relic. Why? Because if you remarried, it meant you were never that virtuous to begin with. The Qing dynasty was especially hardcore about this. Officials would reward chaste widows with arches, yes, actual stone arches built at village entrances to honor their unwavering devotion. These weren't just local tributes. They were official state propaganda using your misery as a billboard for national virtue. Imagine that your husband's been gone for 40 years. You've been eating cold rice in silence since you were 23, and now there's a giant monument to your sadness at the front gate. Awesome. Of course, not everyone complied. Some women remarried quietly or were hidden by sympathetic relatives. Others fled to cities where no one knew their history. But the threat of disgrace was real, and enforcement came not just from men, but other women. Mothers-in-law, elder sisters, and village aunties were the gatekeepers of feminine morality. And oh, how they judged. Even literary stories reflect this obsession. In one well-known folk tale, a fox spirit takes the form of a beautiful girl and seduces a scholar. She's clever, charming, and, of course, secretly evil. The lesson: women who enjoy or seek intimacy are unnatural. The ideal girl is passive, quiet, and most of all silent about desire. That silence becomes your armor. You laugh too loudly. You're inappropriate. You ask about your own wedding plans. You're too eager. You breathe in a certain rhythm near a window, and someone says she's got restless quai. The line between propriety and scandal, hair thin and constantly shifting. And when things went really wrong, say you were assaulted or harassed, the silence became survival. Reporting it could shame your family. Not reporting it could trap you forever. Either way, your value was calculated not by what happened to you, but by what you were still perceived to have. Even poetry joined the party. A famous Tang Dynasty verse reads, "She holds the moon in her sleeves untouched by wind or word." Beautiful, right? But underneath, it's a coded reminder. Don't speak. Don't move. Don't change. Just glow quietly in your perceived perfection. And that's the cruelest part. Your entire worth could be undone by something you didn't do or something that never happened. Virginity wasn't just about what you were. It was about what everyone believed you were. And if that belief cracked, so did your future. So you sip your tea again, this time, letting the warmth settle a little deeper in your chest. Because here in ancient China, your body is your biography, but your reputation. That's the ink. And once it's spilled, there's no blotting it out. The moon's higher now, casting milky shadows through the lattice windows, and you pull your sleeves tight as if the stories etched into your family's memory might drift in and touch your skin. You've heard them all, haven't you? The widows who never remarried, the daughters who leapt into wells. The silent girls turned saints because they kept their secrets buried deeper than their dreams. Welcome to the cult of chastity. Ancient China's slow-burning obsession turned social institution. Tonight, you walk the narrow ridge where morality politics and patriarchy braid together into something that looks at first glance like virtue. But lean in closer, and it's more like a gilded cage, beautiful but airless. By the late imperial period, especially under the Song Ming and Qing dynasties, chastity wasn't just a private virtue. It was a national policy. Yes, you heard that right. The state got in on it. Imperial edicts praised and rewarded women who chose death over dishonor, loyalty over life. You were no longer just someone's daughter or wife. You were a symbol of state-sanctioned moral order. Confucianism, already the social backbone of Chinese life, got an imperial upgrade. The 3 obediences and 4 virtues became the gold standard of female behavior. If you were a girl, your job was simple. Obey your father when young, your husband when married, and your son when widowed. Sprinkle in moral conduct, proper speech, modest appearance, and diligent work, and ta-da, you were the ideal woman. Historians still argue whether most women truly internalized these codes or performed them for survival. But either way, the effect was real chastity became the gold medal of femininity. And virginity. That was your qualifying round. But here's where things turn from cultural to cultish. During the Ming Dynasty, some local governments erected shrines to women who died preserving their chastity. Some were widows who starved themselves. Others committed suicide rather than be taken by bandits or enemies. Local officials would submit their names to the imperial court requesting a posthumous title or honorific monument. It became competitive villages wanted their own chaste martyrs to show moral superiority, and families. Oh, they weren't just complicit, they were proud. Imagine your mother clutching your memorial plaque and saying, "She died pure," as if that somehow made your absence holy, a fringe tidbit. Some communities held commemorative festivals for these women, offering incense and sweets to their spirits like one might for generals or sages. You became a ghost of virtue, paraded like a trophy on a spectral shelf. Let's not pretend this didn't lead to horrifying outcomes. There are records, dozens of young girls choosing death over rape, or even arranged marriages they didn't consent to, believing that resisting at all costs was the only way to protect their family's name. One Qing-era text describes a 13-year-old who, upon hearing she'd be wed to a widower, twice her age, swallowed gold leaf, and died overnight. Her family proud. They submitted her story for national recognition. She made the cut. Congratulations, little martyr. But here's the twist. The cult of chastity wasn't just about you. It became a mirror for men's honor. If you were faithful, it reflected well on your husband even after death. If you weren't, it wasn't only your shame. It was his ancestors, his lineage. So even in grief, widowers had to police your virtue, sometimes enforcing mourning practices so severe they bordered on torture. Widows were often forbidden from wearing color, forced into dietary restrictions, and barred from participating in family gatherings unless they could prove their loyalty. And guess what counted as proof years of quiet suffering? The fewer complaints you made, the holier you seemed. But let's not pretend the system was perfectly airtight. Women found cracks. Some escaped oppressive households and joined all-female religious sects or remote monastic communities, where ironically chastity still reigned, but with less scrutiny from male authority. Others quietly remarried under false names in distant provinces. Some simply lied. Because in a world where your virginity was currency, sometimes forgery was survival. And here's where it gets philosophical. What happens to a society when its highest female ideal is absence? Absence of desire, absence of rebellion, absence of any past. You weren't praised for what you did. You were praised for what you never did. You were good because you said no. And sometimes because you said nothing at all. It's no wonder so many female ghosts in Chinese folklore are restless. They appear on bridges, in forests, beside rivers, half-glimpsed figures with sad eyes and unfinished stories. Women who died too soon, often violently, often virgins. And the people who meet them, almost always men. Call it poetic justice or cultural guilt, but these spirits are more than just creepy bedtime tales. They're the echoes of a system that demanded everything and gave back nothing but posthumous praise. Even in the arts, this ideal left fingerprints. Painters created scrolls showing noble women holding fans in quiet gardens, unmarried, undisturbed. Poets wrote verses celebrating female recluses who fled society to preserve their virtue. You became worthy by disappearing. Here's a quirky fringe case. In one instance, a woman was so admired for her virginity that her unused bridal chamber was turned into a shrine. Local women came to pray there, hoping to inherit her restraint. Because nothing says blessed life like being remembered for a bed you never touched. By now, you're starting to see the layers virginity as virtue chastity, as currency, purity as performance. It was a moral economy where men wrote the rules and women paid the price. But just beneath the surface, resistance simmered quiet, clever, and cloaked in modesty. Because even within the cult of chastity, some women found ways to choose their silence. And that, in its own way, was a kind of power. So you close the window, letting the paper screen rustle into place. You light a tiny lantern, its glow soft and flickering, and you wonder if you were born into this world, would you go quietly, or would your virtue have teeth? You stretch your fingers, listening to the soft creak of bamboo outside your window, as a breeze slips through the cracks. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barks, then silence again. It's the kind of stillness that feels almost sacred, like the world is holding its breath. And in that pause, you start to understand something deeper. This whole system, this reverence for female virginity, wasn't just about sex or purity, or even morality. It was about property. Yup. Virginity was part of your family's asset management strategy. In ancient China, marriage wasn't just a romantic or personal affair. It was a contractual transaction, a transfer of wealth and honor between families. And you were the most delicate, fragile piece of that puzzle. Your body wasn't yours. It was your father's to protect, your husband's to claim, and your children's to reflect. You were a walking seal of authenticity, and if that seal was broken, so was the deal. Let's talk dowries and bride prices for a minute. These weren't random gifts, they were complex systems of balance. Your family would provide a dowry, furniture, silk, jewelry, perhaps a servant or two. The groom's side would pay a bride price money, livestock, or land. But, and here's the kicker, the perceived chastity of the bride could drastically change the terms. Virgin brides secured better marriages, bigger gifts, higher social status. If you had even a whisper of scandal trailing you, your dowry had to be higher to compensate, or your marriage prospects fell to the bottom tier. Some families went into debt trying to maintain the illusion of purity, staging elaborate rites to prove a daughter's virginity. There are even stories, fringe but telling, of girls being tested for their hymens before marriage. Whether those tests had any real anatomical merit is beside the point. The idea was that your body could be evaluated like livestock before purchase. Imagine that horror, your wedding day looming, and you're essentially being inspected like fine porcelain. If there's a crack, no sale. Historians still argue whether these virginity tests were widespread or localized, but the fear of them was enough to keep girls in a constant state of self-surveillance. Don't run. Don't ride horses. Don't jump from high steps. Anything could be seen as risking your virtue. It's no wonder that women became masters of subtle resistance. Some tied herbal sachets around their waists to create proof of virginity on the wedding night. Yes, we're talking about fake blood packets made from herbs and crushed berries. Others relied on the old trick of timing and dim candlelight. Because when your value depends on what your husband thinks he sees, illusion can be a form of survival. And here's something that might make you do a double take. If a woman was raped, her family might still be forced to apologize to the groom's family. Yes, even if she'd fought back. Even if she was taken by force. Because in this system it wasn't about justice. It was about damage control. There's a tragic record of a case from the Song dynasty where a woman kidnapped and assaulted during a border raid was returned to her village. Instead of being welcomed back, she was ostracized, and her fiancé's family demanded that her parents return the betrothal gifts with interest. The woman, she later became a Buddhist nun. Not out of spiritual calling, but because there was nowhere else to go. And this is where virginity ties directly into another powerful force: inheritance law. In patrilineal China, bloodlines were sacred. A child born to a virgin bride was presumed to carry pure paternal lineage. But if the bride wasn't a virgin, or worse, if there were questions about paternity, everything unraveled. Suddenly, legitimacy was in doubt. Property rights got messy. Family lines blurred. This paranoia became so deeply ingrained that some elite families created separate records distinguishing sons of main wives from sons of concubines or suspicious backgrounds. If you were the son of a woman accused of premarital impurity, good luck inheriting the ancestral lands. And yes, this is where the hypocrisy hits like a gong. Men were free to sow their oats, keep mistresses, visit brothels, and still be considered honorable. But a woman, one slip, real or imagined, and her entire bloodline was considered suspect. There's even a fringe tidbit where some elite families buried genealogies with locked seals only to be opened generations later. Why? To ensure no one tampered with the recorded legitimacy of the heirs. It's a medieval version of blockchain, but with way more ghosts. And oh, the ghosts. We can't talk about property and virginity without mentioning ancestral worship. Your actions didn't just affect your immediate family. They were believed to echo through generations, affecting your ancestors' peace and your descendants' fortunes. If you married impure, or worse, bore a child out of wedlock, it was said you could anger the ancestral spirits. And angry ancestors. They didn't mess around. People believed they could cause illness, failed crops, even premature death. So your virginity was kind of like a spiritual tax payment essential for keeping the dead happy and the family tree upright. All of this meant your wedding night wasn't just intimate. It was ceremonial inspection. And everyone from your new mother-in-law to the neighborhood matchmaker waited for proof. The blood-stained bedsheet proudly shown the next morning wasn't just awkward tradition. It was an economic receipt. Here's the proof our contract is fulfilled. She was what we paid for, and if the sheet stayed white, well, you probably didn't eat breakfast that day. Still, some women, bold, brilliant ones, found ways to flip the script. A story survives about a woman in the Ming Dynasty who, knowing she was in love with a man below her station, faked a scandal to ruin her value on the marriage market. Her family, shamed, had no choice but to let her marry the man she loved. Legend says she lived happily ever after, scandalous and unapologetic. Because sometimes being ruined meant being free. So tonight, as you roll to one side and stare at the grain of the wooden ceiling, you might realize something important. In a world that measured women like coin virginity wasn't purity, it was price tag. And for every girl who stayed silent, there was one who quietly rewrote the rules. The room is warmer now, and your thoughts wander like drifting incense smoke. You've journeyed through temples and tombs, shrines and scandals, all orbiting the glittering core of virginity. But what about love? You blink at the word. Did love even stand a chance in this world of contracts and bloodied bedsheets? You press deeper into your pillow and slide into a different dream, one not of rigid roles and filial duties, but of stolen glances and quiet laughter. It's time to explore how virginity shaped and warped romantic ideals in ancient China. Let's start with a bittersweet truth. Romantic love rarely stood alone. It was usually tangled up in duty obedience and social expectations. If you were a young woman, your ideal man wasn't the poetic soul whispering beneath a willow tree. He was the one your parents chose. And for him, your virginity was the seal of sincerity. Not because it meant you loved him more, but because it proved you had never loved anyone else. That's where the paradox begins. Love was often expected to bloom after marriage, not before. If you dared fall for someone first, especially if you acted on it, you risked becoming damaged goods. So, romantic tension became this delicate, high-stakes dance flirt, but don't be obvious. Show interest, but keep it shrouded in metaphor. Love was a story told through poetry and silence, and no one told it better than the legendary Kai Wenji, a brilliant poet and musician kidnapped by Xiongnu nomads during the Han Dynasty. She married one of them, had children, and lived in exile for 12 years. When she was finally ransomed back to China, she was forced to leave her children behind, because as a woman who had borne another man's children, she could never fully reclaim her former purity. Her love, though real and deep, was overwritten by the stain of non-virgin motherhood. Historians still argue whether Kai Wenji's tale was sanitized or romanticized by later Confucian scholars trying to fold her back into the ideal woman narrative. After all, her story became more famous for her return to virtue than for the trauma of losing her family. That's love rewritten by patriarchy with a Confucian pen. But the real romantic landscape wasn't always so tragic. Sometimes forbidden love flourished beneath the surface. Enter the Wenren scholar gentleman, who wrote poems, painted scrolls, and sometimes fell madly in love with courtesans. And here's the twist, many of those courtesans weren't virgins. In fact, their lack of purity is partly what freed them to love openly. These women, often trained in music, poetry, and conversation, weren't shackled by family contracts or virginity tests. Because they were already outside the system, they had space, however narrow, to flirt, banter, and choose. Some became muses. A few became wives. Most remained tragically unattainable, because while men could fall in love with them, they rarely dared to marry them. Virginity once again stood guard at the gate of social legitimacy. You sip that thought slowly, because here comes the fringe tidbit 1. Tang Dynasty love poem tells of a courtesan who, desperate to start over as a pure woman, pretends to be mute for 3 years while living in a remote village. When she finally speaks again, she claims her silence was a vow of chastity. People believe her. She marries a scholar. They live a quiet life. And no one ever suspects her past. That story, probably a myth. But the fact that it exists says something loud. Purity could be performed, even reinvented. The trick was convincing others that you'd never been touched by men or memory. In folk tales, the ideal woman is often imagined as soft-spoken, obedient, and of course, untouched. But she's also longing. You see this in the legendary story of the cowherd and the weaver girl, a mortal man and a celestial woman separated by the Milky Way, allowed to reunite only once a year. Their love is eternal but chaste. Their longing defines them more than their union. Love in these stories is more about absence than presence. You love someone by not being with them. You prove your devotion by waiting. Sound familiar? That's virginity logic dressed in starlight. But not all stories bow to this logic. Take Li Qingzhao, one of the greatest female poets of the Song dynasty. She married for love. Her early poems are flirty tender and full of playful innuendo, yes. Ancient Chinese pillow talk was a thing. But after her husband died, and war shattered her world, her poetry darkened. She never remarried. She mourned him fiercely. And yet she refused to become a symbol of perfect widowhood. She drank. She grieved loudly. She stayed alive. That was radical. Because in her time, the best widow was a silent widow, preferably dead. Instead, Li Qingzhao chose voice over virtue. She made love a memory, not a moral. Still, for most women, romantic love remained a luxury, not a right. Your wedding might include tender moments, a shy smile behind a red veil, a whispered joke on the carriage ride, but those flickers had to survive a lifetime of expectations. Love was hoped for, but never guaranteed. What was guaranteed? The scrutiny of your behavior, especially if your family name or your husband's was on the line. And here's where it gets cruelly ironic. Even if you did wait, did everything right, kept every rule, your husband could still take concubines. Love was one-sided. Virginity was one time. But male privilege that was eternal. So women found other ways to love. Some formed intense emotional bonds with their female friends, letters filled with longing and poetry gifts exchanged in secret. These weren't always romantic in a modern sense, but they were deep chosen connections untouched by patriarchal rules. When everything else was arranged, friendship became the last frontier of genuine feeling. Tonight, as you lie with one hand resting on your chest, you start to wonder in a world where virginity was currency and marriage, a contract. What happened to intimacy? Was it stolen? Hidden, smuggled into stolen hours between the rules. You picture a young woman writing a love poem by candlelight, knowing she can never send it. You picture a husband touching her cheek, then turning away to join another wife in another chamber. You picture her waiting always, waiting her love held back like water behind a dam. And you wonder softly, did she ever wish she'd lied? A few hours before dawn, your room takes on that eerie blue-gray tint, where everything looks softer, blurrier, almost unanchored. You listen for the wind, the sound of distant crickets, the world exhaling in its sleep. And now finally you step into the shadows cast by all those rules and rituals. Because where there are rules, there are always transgressions. Tonight you meet the rebels, the outliers, and the quietly scandalous who defied the virginity code and lived to whisper about it, or sometimes shout depending on how brave they were. You may think of ancient China as stiff, hierarchical, bound by Confucian doctrines etched into bronze. But human beings, we're slippery. And virginity. It was not always a given. Let's peel back the lacquer and peek into the margins. You start in the Tang dynasty, a surprisingly vibrant cosmopolitan era, when Chang'an was the heartbeat of poetry fashion and philosophical experimentation. Here, things got a little looser. It wasn't a free-for-all don't pack your toga, but court ladies and poetesses often enjoyed more agency than you'd expect. Some even wrote openly about passion loss and, yes, physical desire. Fringe historical tidbit time. A Tang noblewoman reportedly hosted salons where both men and women gathered to read poetry by candlelight and discuss Taoist ideas of body and spirit. At least one love poem survives that includes imagery of a first kiss under moonlight, hardly the stuff of strict chastity oaths. Historians still argue whether these were widespread behaviors or isolated cases among the elite, but the records are there. Love and even premarital intimacy weren't always synonymous with ruin. Then there's Taoism, quietly nudging the conversation away from rigidity. Unlike Confucianism, which treated virginity like moral currency, Taoist thinkers sometimes viewed sexuality as part of cosmic balance. There were actual practices involving yin and yang, male and female energies, exchanging through intercourse, not all of which required marital status. Some women became Taoist adepts, choosing spiritual paths that gave them authority over their own bodies. And, yes, sometimes lovers. It wasn't mainstream, and most of these women were exceptions, not norms, but the path was there, worn faint by the brave. Now you step into darker corners where rebellion wasn't poetry, it was punishable. The stakes could be deadly. A girl caught losing her virginity before marriage might face shame exile or even execution. And yet stories persist of young women running away with lovers faking deaths, dressing as men to escape arranged marriages. You probably won't survive this, whispers the old system. And still some tried anyway. One famous case involves Pan Jinlian, a fictional but infamous character in Chinese literature. She cheats on her husband, murders him, and becomes a folk symbol of lustful women. Over time, her name becomes shorthand for immoral femininity. But here's the twist. Some scholars argue she represents society's fear of women who claim their sexuality. She's not a warning, she's a projection. Like, what if she wasn't evil, just fed up? That brings you to the underground networks of cloistered girls and courtesans. The line between them often blurred. Some were trapped. Others learned to manipulate the system, passing as virgins long after the truth was lost to memory. They became artists of discretion, masters of veils, timing, and theater. If a husband believed, society believed. And that belief, sometimes it was more powerful than facts. But what about the everyday girls, the farmer's daughters, the shopkeeper's nieces? They weren't writing poetry or sipping wine in salons. Their resistance was quieter. Maybe they passed notes to boys at the well. Maybe they married late and claimed it was from piety, not preference. Maybe they faked shyness to avoid marriage entirely. These weren't revolutions. They were microscopic acts of agency. You want a real curveball. Some widows chose not to remarry, not out of virtue, but as a loophole. By staying faithful to a dead husband, they escaped the control of fathers or brothers. Widowhood became freedom dressed in mourning clothes. They ran shops, raised children, and made choices real ones. Some even kept secret lovers cloaked in shadows and silence. Of course, society had a name for women like this, dangerous. There were also rare but vivid accounts of women who publicly rejected virginity standards. In a court document from the Yuan dynasty, a woman sued her husband for impotence and requested an annulment. She openly admitted she had expected a sexual relationship and that her virtue was being wasted. Scandalous, absolutely. Empowering, you bet. It's like ancient Chinese court meets Judge Judy, but with more robes and less commercial break. So was everyone following the rules, not even close. But the myth of perfect virginity persisted, because it kept the structure intact. The stories of rebellion were often rewritten, diluted, or buried entirely. And here's the most human part of it all. Some girls weren't resisting or embracing the rules, they were just confused, trying to balance what they were told with what they felt, dreaming of weddings, and worrying about what would happen if they stumbled. Love and fear living side by side. The system didn't need perfect believers, just enough compliance to keep the illusion alive. There's an eerie beauty in all of this. Virginity was treated like a priceless gem, a sealed envelope, a national treasure, and yet every generation had its forgers, its thieves, and its quiet dissidents. Because no matter how heavily the door was bolted, desire always found a crack. You can almost see her now, that girl in a brocade robe, standing at the edge of her family's courtyard. Her hair's pinned high, her future decided, and yet her eyes scan the wall, imagining what lies beyond it. She might obey. She might rebel. But for one breathless second, she is herself unowned and unclaimed. And that, in a world built on control, is the most dangerous thing of all. You're drifting now. Not quite asleep, but not fully awake either. The kind of twilight state where your thoughts echo and the past doesn't seem so distant. You've watched virginity be worshipped, weaponized, redefined, and even faked. But now it's time to see what happened when it collided with the law. You sit upright, well metaphorically, as the courtroom doors creak open. And in walks the system judge's official scrolls inked with rules thicker than a Confucian uncle's eyebrows. Because in ancient China, female virginity wasn't just a moral ideal, It was often codified, inspected, litigated. Let's start where bureaucracy meets the bedchamber virginity as legal evidence. In many dynastic periods, especially under the Tang and Ming legal codes, a woman's sexual status could determine the outcome of court cases, marital disputes, inheritance battles, even accusations of rape. If you could prove you were a virgin, the court was more likely to believe you were assaulted. If not, well, good luck. That's not justice, it's a purity test disguised as law. The Tang Code. One of the most comprehensive early legal documents laid out explicit punishments for eloping, women fornication, and adultery. Virginity before marriage wasn't just a social virtue, it was a requirement. If a woman cohabited with a man before marriage, both could be punished, though the penalties were harsher for her. A man might lose face. A woman might lose everything, even more grim. In some regions, a woman who was raped but didn't fight back enough could still be punished for losing her chastity. Let that sink in. The crime wasn't just the assault. It was the loss of purity regardless of consent. You're lying there in court, bruised and broken, and someone's checking whether you screamed loudly enough to qualify for mercy. Horrifying but real. Historians still argue whether these laws were widely enforced or primarily symbolic, intended more to scare than to sentence. But the threat was always there, looming like a guillotine above your love life. Fringe detail alert. There are rare court records of women who successfully defended their honor using clever logic or poetry. One famous case tells of a girl accused of sleeping with a servant. In court, she argued that the rumors began only after she rejected a neighbor's marriage proposal. She then recited a poem about the moon's reflection in water, untouchable, though many try. The judge, impressed, dismissed the case. Her virginity was restored not through evidence but imagery, like legal haiku. Still, those were exceptions. For most women, the law wasn't a refuge. It was a trap, and don't think marriage freed you. Once you were married, the pressure just shifted. A wife was expected to embody zhenjie, chaste and faithful. If your husband died, you were supposed to go full dramatic widow mode. No makeup, no remarrying, maybe even suicide, if you were ambitious about your legacy. Why? Because your loyalty, like your virginity, had to be absolute. By the Ming Dynasty, widows were being publicly honored for choosing death over remarriage. Some received special archways called virtuous widow gates, stone memorials, proclaiming their chastity to the world. The kicker. Most of these women were teenagers. They'd been married a few months, maybe a year before their husbands died. And rather than live a long, independent life, they were pressured to become icons of dead devotion. You get the feeling the legal system wasn't really built to protect women, it was built to preserve male lineage. A virgin wife ensured paternity. A chaste widow ensured legacy. And any disruption to that chain, that was the real crime. Even the punishment system reflected this imbalance. Men caught in extramarital affairs might face exile or fines. Women, public shame, physical punishment, or forced suicide. There's even a recorded case of a girl who had a premarital affair and was forced by local officials to marry the man, give up her dowry, and then be divorced immediately. So she'd be ruined and ineligible for anyone else. That's not justice. That's revenge masquerading as law. But not all laws were patriarchal in tone. Some dynasties experimented with reforms. During brief, progressive moments, officials debated whether moral policing was helping or hurting families. A few even suggested that obsessing over virginity was weakening the economy by preventing remarriage and stifling women's productivity. Imagine that memo. Let's chill on the chastity thing, it's bad for GDP. Still, the backlash was swift. Every time things softened, a new wave of moral purists would tighten the reins. Like the Qing dynasty, which swung back hard toward rigid virtue. They codified Confucian ethics into law so tightly that it became almost impossible for women to remarry without being viewed as damaged. A widow could be denied property rights simply for showing interest in someone else. And here's where it gets especially strange. Some local courts began honoring ghost marriages where women were betrothed to deceased men to preserve their chastity. You'd be married to a corpse. Why? Because it meant you'd never belong to a living man again. Virginity in this case was protected by death itself. That's not metaphor. That's literal law. And speaking of the dead, forensic virginity checks. Yes, you read that right, were a thing. If a young woman died under suspicious circumstances, local officials might order a post-mortem examination of her genitalia to determine if she'd been sexually active. Your body, even in death, wasn't fully yours. It belonged to your reputation, to your father, to a narrative you could no longer edit. The system was consistent. At least your virginity belonged to the legal machine from the moment you were born until long after you stopped breathing. And yet some women found tiny loopholes, secret wills, hidden marriages, elopements that became official only after a respectable waiting period. The law might be rigid, but people wiggle. And as history shows us, even the tightest laws can't completely crush desire, survival, or self-preservation. So tonight, as your breath slows and your limbs melt into the mattress, you remember purity wasn't always a virtue. Sometimes it was a weapon, a litmus test, a performance. And sometimes it was just a quiet lie whispered to the court, a strategic nod to a system that demanded too much and gave too little. You imagine a girl on trial surrounded by scrolls and scowls, raising her chin and daring them to prove anything. Her body might be on trial, but her spirit. That's already long gone, sprinting across a meadow laughing at all of them. The night grows stiller, softer. Outside your window, the shadows are no longer stretching, they're simply existing. Heavy, patient. And as you lie there half wrapped in your blanket and drifting deeper into the quiet, you realize tonight's story has never really been about virginity. It's about control. And nowhere is that more obvious than when we start looking at how female virginity in ancient China was not just a family affair, not even just a legal obsession, but something the state tried to regulate, record and reward. Yes, you heard that right. Governments got into the virginity business. Let's rewind to the early imperial periods. Dynasties like the Han began experimenting with what scholars now call virtue governance. Basically, it's when emperors try to run the country not just with laws and taxes, but by shaping morals. Virginity was high on the list. Officials issued edicts praising chaste women, especially widows who stayed loyal to dead husbands. Some were even enshrined in official histories, right next to military heroes and inventors. That's right, die of heartbreak at 16, and you might get a footnote next to the guy who built the Great Wall. One real example, a woman named Lady Lu, who committed suicide after her husband's death, became a model of loyalty. The emperor issued a commendation, and her family was rewarded with land. That's the state literally paying dividends on virginity-adjacent virtue. You know, in case you thought this was all abstract. What's quirky about all this is how openly transactional it became. Families began competing for these virtue titles, submitting their widowed daughters or virginal cousins, like they were auditioning for some grim Confucian reality show. Next, on Chastity Idol, a 14-year-old who's never smiled at a man. There were forms, ceremonies, and even engraved plaques to commemorate your unblemished loyalty. You were basically a walking monument to your own repression. But here's the sneaky part: the state didn't push virginity just for virtue's sake. It was also about stability. If women obeyed, families stayed intact. If families stayed intact, taxes got paid and the imperial court could rest easy. It was social engineering disguised as moral high ground. You weren't just expected to be chaste, you were told it was for the good of the empire. Like a patriotic duty. Do it for China, sweetheart. Historians still argue whether most women believed in these ideals or just performed them to survive. After all, when virtue comes with rice stipends and public praise, even suffering gets an incentive package. But the truth is, many likely internalized it. It's hard not to when your worth is measured in your ability to not do something. And then came the state-run virginity investigations. Yes, that's a thing. In some dynasties, especially during times of social unrest, local magistrates were ordered to verify the reputations of women, especially if they were petitioning for a widow's honorific or seeking certain inheritance rights. The process was humiliating. Your neighbors got interviewed. Your servants were questioned. If you were a widow, officials checked whether you'd worn makeup or hosted male visitors. So basically the ancient version of being doxxed, but by your local government. Want a particularly weird moment. Some Ming officials debated whether parrots in a widow's home should be considered suspicious. Why? Because parrots can mimic voices, and there was concern that a talkative bird might repeat something incriminating. Imagine being accused of unchastity because your bird overheard you flirting and squawked about it in front of a visiting inspector. Nice legs and boom, your virtue is revoked. Even more unsettling, these investigations extended to the dead. Families submitted detailed reports to officials about their deceased female relatives, hoping for posthumous honors. These weren't just eulogies, they were like moral resumes. Died a virgin, never looked at men, spoke only when spoken to, enjoyed embroidery. It's like the afterlife had a dress code, and if you didn't meet it, you didn't make the cut. Of course, some clever families faked these reputations. They hired scribes to write glowing accounts. They bribed local elders to vouch for non-existent chastity. One historian even found a case where 3 unrelated women were all buried under the same honorary chaste widow arch. Talk about an overbooked tombstone. It was virtue as branding, and in some places it worked. But sometimes the state used virginity politics to punish dissent. If a powerful family stepped out of line, their daughters might suddenly find their reputations under scrutiny. Accusations of impurity were an easy way to destroy political enemies, because once you questioned a woman's sexual honor, the whole family tree got infected with shame. Virginity wasn't just a virtue. It was a weapon. You see the same thing play out in imperial court politics. Empresses and concubines constantly battled not just for favor, but for the illusion of purity. In one scandal, an empress accused a rival concubine of seducing a palace guard. There was an inquiry, palace servants were interrogated, and the accused woman was eventually exiled, even though there was no proof. Why? Because once the accusation was made, the damage was already done. And yes, virginity checks happened in the Forbidden City too. future imperial consorts were often inspected physically and socially before selection. Not unlike livestock at a market, but with more silk robes and poetry. Even a whisper of prior intimacy could disqualify a girl. But if you passed, well, congratulations. You were now the emperor's property. Forever. Who's ready for a lifetime of guarded courtyards and formal titles? It's easy to forget just how all-encompassing the system was. Virginity wasn't just between you and your body. It was between you, your family, your government, and your afterlife. It was a passport, a branding, a bet placed by everyone around you that you'd never cross a line they drew for you. And somehow, despite it all, women still lived, still schemed, still laughed, fell in love, raised children, whispered secrets, and sometimes, when no one was looking, chose to rewrite their roles. Maybe it was a false confession to protect a friend. Maybe it was helping a sister sneak away in the night. Maybe it was simply lying convincingly about what you did or didn't do. Because if the state was playing theater, then women could become actors too. Now, as the moon arcs lower in the sky and the soft mechanical buzz of your fan spins the air like threads, you feel the weight of that history, pressing down not to crush you, but to remind you that even when control seemed complete, even when virginity was stamped and certified by the empire itself, the human spirit wriggled out. Always. By now, your breath has settled into a quiet rhythm, and the lines between history and dream are starting to blur. But stay with me just a little longer, because now we're entering the most intimate chapter of all, the one that takes place not in courtrooms or palaces, but in the home behind closed doors, in whispers, passed from mother to daughter. Virginity in ancient China wasn't only something men guarded courts judged or emperors exploited. It was also something women taught, feared, faked, and sometimes quietly rejected. Tonight, you're slipping into the soft hush of private lives, into bedrooms, back kitchens, hidden scrolls, and secret rituals. This is where the public performance of purity meets the private strategies for survival. Let's talk about the education of a good girl. From childhood, daughters were taught how to behave not just to avoid shame, but to be marketable. Virginity wasn't about your body, it was about your value. A desirable bride was modest, obedient, and of course untainted. Mothers coached their daughters in the art of demure silence, of looking down at the right moment of walking without shaking the hips too much. Yes, even walking styles were policed. You weren't just protecting your virginity, you were curating a brand. Fringe fact, in some regions, girls were taught to wear layers of perfume-scented pouches under their skirts, supposedly to preserve their inner balance. But elders also whispered that the scent could act like a protective charm, warding off lustful spirits, or even real men. Essentially, Chanel No. 5, but make it a chastity talisman. Still, with all this ritual and symbolism, there was one glaring problem. A big one. Virginity as an idea rested on something you can't actually measure. Despite all the talk of hymens and physical signs, science doesn't work that way. The body doesn't come with a purity seal. Historians still argue whether families truly believed in these tests, or if they were just performing belief to keep order. But that didn't stop anyone from trying. Enter the infamous wedding night bloodstain ritual. Maybe you've heard of this. In many households after the wedding night, a white cloth was presented to the bride's family, showing proof of consummation. But more importantly, it was supposed to display blood as evidence of an intact virgin. No blood, you were in trouble. Families might demand explanations, compensation, even divorce. Some brides were sent back like defective goods. Here's where women got clever. There are quiet legends passed along not in history books, but in back-alley conversations, and grandmother lore of girls who staged the blood. They'd prick their fingers before the wedding night, or hide packets of animal blood in their sleeves. One story tells of a young woman who used crushed red beans soaked in water, messy, convincing, and strangely poetic. Like a culinary rebellion. Here, mother-in-law. Enjoy your honor in bean broth. In other cases, women confided in maidservants or wet nurses, the older women who'd seen the system up close and weren't buying it anymore. These midwives of deception taught their girls how to fool husbands, how to hide their pasts, and how to survive a society obsessed with false signs. And sometimes deception wasn't needed at all. There were girls who walked proudly into their wedding nights, unafraid even if they weren't virgins. Lovers before marriage weren't just a modern thing, you know. Some women fell for scholars, some for servants, some for soldiers passing through, and some simply wanted to know themselves before being handed over to a stranger. Radical right, but those stories rarely got told. And if they did, they were rewritten, turned into cautionary tales, or erased altogether. Still, you can almost hear them, can't you? Buried between the lines of proper Confucian texts, the whisper beneath the ink. Even in marriage, the performance continued. Wives had to act innocent, chaste, almost unaware of sex, even after giving birth to 4 children. One manual advised women to lie still and silent during intimacy, so as not to disturb the man's rhythm. Another said a wife should never speak of her body or pleasures aloud, lest the illusion of modesty be broken. That illusion had to be sustained forever. Virginity, after all, wasn't just about before marriage. It was also about acting like you'd never wanted anything more than duty. Desire was masculine, restraint feminine, always. Still, women resisted in small ways. A wife might write poetry coated with romantic longing, or collect herbal aphrodisiacs hidden in the kitchen, or secretly visit temple fairs where masked flirtation was possible. Remember that ancient sunscreen made of crocodile dung. Well, there were also love potions made from lotus seed and wine, supposedly to stir male interest, or, depending on who you asked, female boldness. And sometimes women simply found strength in each other. Older sisters would protect younger ones, shielding them from predatory matchmakers. Aunts might quietly arrange better marriages, even at social cost. Mothers passed down secret wisdom between brush strokes and lullabies. It was an invisible network of survival love and quiet rebellion. Virginity may have been the expected path, but many women built side roads. There's even an account of a bride who, after being humiliated by her in-laws for not bleeding properly, took the stained wedding sheet, walked into the village square, and publicly burned it, declaring, "My blood is not your proof." The court records labeled her mad, but the neighbors, they called her brave. So you lie there now, wondering how many women wore masks so convincingly they forgot their own reflections. How many held their secrets tight under layers of silk? How many laughed when no one was listening? Virginity wasn't always a lie. But it was rarely the truth they said it was. It was a symbol, a script, a delicate role passed down through generations of girls taught to tiptoe bow and bleed on cue. And yet, through all the rituals, the accusations, the performance, real women lived. They adapted. They tricked, taught, endured. and sometimes when the world wasn't looking, told the truth to someone they trusted. Quietly, gently, over tea, or tears, or a shared look across the wedding chamber floor. It's a comfort, isn't it, that even in a world so consumed by control, there was still this undercurrent of agency, cleverness, and unspoken sisterhood. Now, one more section awaits. But for now, linger in this space, a secret garden behind locked doors, where the truth about virginity isn't about blood or body, but about survival. About women being smarter than the system even when the stakes were everything. And now, here you are, barely a breath away from the end of this winding path. This 1,000-year hush about a single word, virginity. A word so quiet and small, but so loaded, it could shape empires, split, families, rewrite lives. Let's take one last step together into the centuries where belief began to waver, where cracks formed in the marble statue, and where new voices started whispering, "What if we don't believe this anymore?" Because everything we've explored tonight, blood rituals, virtue, plaques, chastity tombs, it all began to loosen in the late imperial and early modern periods. You watch it happen like silk unraveling in slow motion, a gentle undoing of the knot. Start with the Qing dynasty, the last imperial chapter. Here the fixation on female chastity reached a strange kind of fever pitch. In some regions, overzealous officials erected archways to commemorate virgins and chaste widows, like actual stone arches with calligraphy and plaques and everything. Walk through town, and you might pass under 5, 6, 10 of these monuments, each one honoring a woman who never remarried or who died before marriage without taint. They were like silent billboards of sacrifice. But here's the weird bit. So many women were getting honored it became a competition. Communities bragged about having more archways than the next village. Families embellished their ancestors' stories, exaggerated the purity, lobbied for more monuments. It was like a civic pride project, but the currency was how many of your women had died unkissed. One local magistrate reportedly joked that the living are jealous of the dead virgins. And honestly, yeah, still the obsession began to backfire. Young girls were terrified of living at all. Widowhood became a death sentence because the only way to be praised was to never move on. Daughters watched their mothers weep silently into tea pinned in place by someone else's idea of virtue. A few rebellious women began to ask, is this really what being good means? Enter the early 20th century, and things shift fast. The fall of the Qing in 1912 opens the door to new voices, new ideas. Reformers, educators, and feminists begin to speak out. They write essays, found newspapers, hold lectures in tea shops and university halls, and they say in bold printed words, a woman's value is not in her virginity. Boom. That sound you hear, it's tradition cracking open like an old lacquer box. One woman, He Yin Zhen, argued in the early 1900s that chastity was a tool of control designed to keep women docile and disposable. Her essays were sharp radical and way ahead of their time. Historians still argue whether she was read widely back then, but her legacy now. Oh, it burns like incense in the bones of every gender studies major. Another fringe story. In Republican-era Shanghai, there were underground theater troupes made entirely of women who reversed traditional roles. They dressed as men, kissed on stage, and performed plots where the virtuous girl broke the rules, ran away, or even gasped, lived happily without a husband. Audiences were stunned. Some were scandalized, but tickets sold out anyway. Art had started saying what mouths still couldn't, But even in the midst of revolution, the myth of virginity didn't vanish overnight. Schools still taught modesty. Marriage brokers still asked, "Is she pure?" Families still hushed scandal with quick weddings or quiet disappearances. Modernity moves like honey fast in some places, stuck in others. And now you lie here centuries away from the first bridal chamber in our story. In a world of LED lights and lock screens and polycotton bed sheets. You'd think virginity would be just an echo. But it lingers, doesn't it? In some wedding rituals, in purity rings, in casual jokes, in awkward health class slides. The past is sneaky that way. It drapes itself over the present like a silk shawl too thin to be noticed, too soft to shrug off completely. But something has changed. Now you can ask questions. You can hear these stories, consider their weight, and decide which parts to carry forward. Virginity isn't gone, but the fear around it is weaker. That's a start. You think of all the women who never had a choice, the ones who stitched silence into their sleeves, who held their breath every time someone said modest, who learned to smile while swallowing their own curiosity. And then you think of the ones who dared quietly, wildly, stubbornly to rewrite the script. A widow who fell in love again and didn't care who knew. A concubine who kept journals. A girl who faked the blood then laughed in private because she won. A servant who whispered, "You don't have to tell them everything. They weren't perfect. They weren't saints. They were human, like you." And so, as your eyelids grow heavy and the space between thoughts stretches wide and slow, remember this virginity in ancient China was never just about sex. It was a story, a performance, a burden, a power play, a myth written on other people's terms. But stories can change, and so can you. Now that we've reached the end, everything feels quieter, doesn't it? Like the noise of history has been turned down to a low, steady hum. You can feel it, not like a fact or a rule, but like the warmth of old paper, like silk sighing against skin, like breath after a long silence. Take this moment to soften, unclench. Let go of every character, every name, every cruel tradition and clever rebellion. Let them slip like warm sand through your fingers. Let your thoughts wander, but slower now. Slower. It's late, and the past is heavy, but your body is light. Each breath you take is a little deeper, a little smoother. The fan hums gently, a soft rhythm against the quiet. Your blanket cradles you like a cocoon spun from stories. The moon outside, still there, still glowing, always watching. No more questions, no more lessons. Just this a stillness earned, a calm deserved. Tomorrow will come bright and full of modern mess. But for now, you're not in tomorrow. You're floating in a space stitched together from memory and imagination and the hush between heartbeats. There's nothing to prove here. Nothing to protect. Nothing to be but exactly this still. So close your eyes if you haven't already. Sink in. Let the centuries recede. The women we met tonight. They're resting now, too. Somewhere safe. Somewhere quiet. Sleep well, dream deep, and remember, you are not a myth. You are the author.